Okay, guys, welcome to virtual world history here. Let me get the door real quick. Okay, so this is unexpected. We're going to do the best we can today. Okay, we're going to see how this goes. We may not even end up going with this format, but for this section of notes, we'll try it out, see how it works. Post a link on YouTube, and then we'll go from there. Okay, I've done this a few times with a couple other classes. First time I've done it with you guys, so the real benefit to this is that you're going to be able to kind of pause it, play back if you didn't get it. If you're slow writing the notes, Darrell Fletcher, then what you'll be able to do is pause the video and just take your time writing, and get through the rest of it. Please do not, pause the video once we get to the end of the pieces of notes, because there are parts of what I'm going to tell you that is going to make sense of the things that we talk about, that is going to be part of your test this coming week. You have a test that is due to me on Thursday. It's going to be a take-home test. We'll talk about that as we come to it, though. For now, let's get through talking about the Boer War. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of review. Just kind of reviewing the things that we talked about first, and then we will get to talking about the Boer War. So we did speak about the scramble for Africa. Okay, so we had gotten through this. We talked about the scramble for Africa and how this competition was fueled by nationalism, right? Competition between the European countries. They ended up going through and taking over all these chunks of Africa. Here was basically as much land as you could take yourself. So that's pretty much where we left off. We got through talking about atrocities. You may remember discussing the Congo at length, right, with King Leopold, and we went on from there. So I know with some of the classes we ended up getting through this bit. I don't think we did for all of it. For everybody, but here is that information. The remaining information you will end up needing. With this, a couple of things. We mentioned the other day that 90% of Africa was colonized. It still leaves about 10%. What 10% are we talking about? Well, it's two countries essentially. You're going to see Liberia, and Ethiopia are going to be the two that were not colonized. Liberia, because that was not a U.S. colony, but it was colonized by ex-U.S. slaves, and so the Europeans left that alone. Ethiopia, on the other hand, was attempted to be colonized, primarily by Italy. But Italy failed in that endeavor. So that's important to recognize. Italy is going to fail in that endeavor. Also, Ethiopia is going to have some distinct advantages. One is a geographical advantage. They're going to essentially be surrounded by mountains. The other one being the fact that they're going to act as a buffer state. They are going to manipulate the states around them. And if you remember from the previous slide, they're going to be surrounded, or they're going to be partially surrounded by the British, who are not going to attempt to colonize them, and then of course by the Italians. So they're going to kind of manipulate both sides. Not only that, but they're going to get Russia involved to a limited extent, in that Russia recognizes that the Ethiopians are Orthodox Christian, which kind of makes them bros, right? And so they want to look out for each other. They end up looking out for Ethiopia, providing them with money, ammo, everything except for physical involvement on the part of Russians fighting Italians. So Ethiopia is able to keep the imperialists at bay. Other things that we're going to see. After most of these imperial governments are these imperial powers kind of settle in, they are going to set up African governments. Because remember, the whole idea, how was it that Europeans justified this? They justified it because it's going to be about establishing civilization, or helping them achieve civilization. So they set them up with governments. They are going to be indirectly ruled by Africans, but those Africans are ultimately going to listen to and be obedient to the powers that be. Okay, so if Uganda, that they adhered to the British Crown, which at that point was Queen Victoria. Other than that, you're going to see the main atrocity is going to be labor. That the whole point of the big point to Europe going over there was establishing colonies in other places. And if they're going to establish these colonies, what they're going to need is they're going to need these Africans to work for as little money as possible to get things like what they were going for the Belgium, which was rubber, right? We had talked about that, as well as gold, diamonds, and other resources that we partially mentioned before, but we really get into it once we start talking about South Africa. But the point of the matter is that this is not an advantageous relationship for the Africans living here, and that it is the European powers that are going to be exploiting them. Okay, so now we will get into talking about the Boer War. So this was the last bit, okay, and I want to separate this because it's worth talking about by itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Boer War. This is a match between not whites and blacks necessarily, although the black South Africans were involved, but it's really going to be about two colonizing groups. One much more powerful than the other. So let's see where this discussion goes. So the context is South Africa, and before we get into this section of notes, I think it's important that we establish where South Africa was. First of all, it had been settled by the Dutch a long time prior. Okay, I'm talking about like 1600s. There were Dutch settlers that came in. Remember, what was the big thing that got the Dutch from the Netherlands now? What was the big thing that got them wealthy? The answer you should be thinking about is trade. Okay, so they're going to be trading not just in Europe, but all over the world. And one of the places they end up settling is going to be South Africa. So British ended up establishing a colony there in 1806, kind of along with them. But this was a small colony, and it wouldn't take off for a long while. Okay, so now you've got the Dutch there, you've got the British there. Interesting dynamic to go along with the African natives, who, by the way, are still living in this area. Okay, so things are going to come to blows pretty soon. All right. So. What would end up happening is that the Boers, and let me explain briefly who the Boers are. I know I mentioned they were Dutch, but these are going to be Dutch farmers. This isn't like a formal government, they're not going to have their own military or anything like that. It's basically just a bunch of farmers that settle in this area and that had been living there. And now the British are there. So the Boers, they're going to go to war with the Zulu peoples. First of all, I should mention that the two states that you're going to want to be aware of is this Orange Free State, that's going to be Boer, and then Transvaal, that's going to be another Boer state. So once the British come in, they kind of have their own individual areas. The British didn't care about them much. The Dutch didn't care about the British. And they were both pretty much focused on kicking as many Africans out or killing them as they possibly could, which was in and of itself its own problem. But all in all, you're going to see three independent states. So eventually the British are going to annex. Remember, we talked about the word annex before. They're going to take in the state of Natal. And that's going to leave just Orange Free State and Transvaal as the two Boer states. All right, so because of the take-in, this is creating a little bit of animosity, but still everybody's happy. And then comes the discovery of gold in this area. And that kind of sets off a whole new series of events. Not only gold, but they're going to find for the first time vast amounts of diamonds. So you've got diamonds, you've got gold, and wouldn't you know it, none of this stuff is in Cape Colony, which was where the British were. It was all going to be in Transvaal, okay, which would make Transvaal the most wealthy province in South Africa, and it wouldn't even be close. Well, the British aren't going to put up with them having all of this, okay, amongst the two of them, okay? They're not going to put up with the fact that these farmers have gotten a hold of all these diamonds, especially if there was no way for the farmers really to harvest the diamonds. They're just farmers. Mining isn't exactly their expertise. So the British are going to come up with a plan by which to take this from them. So what ends up happening is, and this isn't the British government doing this, the British citizens, they're miners, because the farmers couldn't use it, or couldn't do it, British miners come in looking to get wealthy, okay? And so more British people move into the state of Transvaal and Orange Free State, and it almost becomes this racist against British type thing. You know, you guys are coming in, you guys are trespassing, you're squatting on our land, and they ended up coming up with a bunch of laws that would discriminate against the British, let alone the Africans. The Africans are already third-rate citizens in that part of the world. So this is going to create more animosity, eventually to the point where the British government is going to have to get involved. So we'll talk about that process next. So, in terms of the Boer War, there's going to be a couple weapons that we should be aware of. One, for the most notably, is the Mauser rifle. Okay, that's going to be in the hands of the Dutch, and the famous saying was, "Trust in God and the Mauser." Okay, meaning that the Mauser was a very dependable rifle. It was a very accurate rifle. And these farmers, these weren't just, they had been trained in hunting too. They didn't have to be formal disciplined soldiers in order to be effective military men, okay? Because, these guys are backwoods guys. They've learned how to shoot, and in fact, they're deadly accurate with a weapon, okay? Almost like farmers we would think of in the United States. We would have the idea here that farmers and people living in rural areas would be pretty good with guns. It was very true in South Africa as well. So you may have noticed that the name Mauser, that's not going to be a Dutch term, okay? In fact, these guns are going to be shipped in from Germany, which we begin to see a little bit of tension between the British and the Germans at this point in time, because essentially it's going to be the Germans who are giving the Dutch guns in order to fight the British. The British are going to be aware of that, so tension starts there as well. The British are going to have the Maxim gun, and it wasn't to say, this wasn't like the Franco-Prussian War where the soldiers didn't know how to use the Maxim gun. It's just that this isn't going to be a very effective war for the Maxim gun for reasons that we will discuss. Still, a very formidable weapon. The term is going to be, this is kind of a famous term in terms of when they were fighting the Africans. This quote here: whatever happens, we have the Maxim gun and they do not. Okay, essentially meaning that we have this deadly weapon, and it really doesn't matter what happens in the war. As long as we have this weapon, we're going to win. So let's talk about the Boer War real quick, okay? The first thing that you should be aware of, and the first thing you should notice, is that this war lasts 3 years. So think about this. You've got the most powerful army in the world, the British, and you've got the Dutch, a bunch of Dutch farmers, and the war lasts 3 years. Okay, so this would be like the farmers in the American Midwest going against the U.S. military, Army, Navy, Marines, right? It's essentially the same idea. on, at surface value, we wouldn't think that would be a war that would last 3 years, but in fact it does, okay, and for reasons that we will discuss. And we know that the great equalizer, as we've discussed before, is guerrilla tactics. That is hiding, seeking. The Boers are going to be familiar with the territory. They're going to be familiar with the land. They're not going to fight in the open field against the British. Their idea is they're going to hide and they're going to fire from far away. The Mauser rifle is going to help because it improves the distance at which they can fire. Also, the Mauser rifle can be reloaded just with your thumb. So it's essentially, you're cocking it and shooting it every single time. And so it's going to have a very fast fire rate, and it's going to give the British some headaches. And the British are never really going to have the opportunity to use the Mauser gun, to use the Maxim gun, because they're never going to fight these guys in an open field. So let's talk about how this went down. The British, they ended up experiencing some problems early on. The Dutch ended up kind of one-upping them battle after battle after battle, to the point where the Dutch ended up going into Cape Town. Okay, so the opposite of what the British are wanting is taking place. Instead of invading the Dutch, they're finding the Dutch are invading them. And so they come up with a plan. Let's talk about that plan real quick. Don't worry about this slide, I'll put it back there. This is this three-pronged attack. It's going to be led by 3 generals. And this guy, Backacre, he's going to be the one heading up the primary attack. But then these other guys are going to have a hand as well. So they are going to lead a 3-pronged attack, meaning they're going to separate their army into 3 separate pieces. And we're going to talk about 2 of those prongs because those end up being the most significant. This gentleman here, his name escapes me at the moment, but he's going to lead kind of that left prong that's going to go up in this direction over here. And what he's going to do, he's going to try to make his way to Kimberley, but he's going to go this way, and he's going to get lost. Okay, they think they're following the map, and then he realizes he's kind of leading his army through this canyon. He has no idea where he is. Eventually it becomes nighttime, and they just kind of continue walking towards their target. And when the day breaks, they realize, oh crap, we're behind enemy lines. So, when they figure that out, they just decide, it's done. Okay, they end up getting fired upon. They end up retreating kind of in chaos. So this guy's prong is done. Okay, he ended up kind of failing at it. So the middle prong is the next one we'll talk about. This was the one that went straight up the middle, and they're going to essentially kind of come up on the open field towards where they knew the positions were going to be. His bread and butter was using artillery to weaken positions, and then what he's going to do is lead an infantry charge after that. The Dutch know that. The Boers are aware of this type of tactic, and so what they do is, on a kind of a high ridge, they end up setting up dummy positions. Okay, so you can see where this is going. They set up dummy positions. They end up hiding down in the low-lying area. British scouts miss all of it, and the British end up firing their artillery on the Dutch dummy positions. Thinking that they've just kind of blown them out of the water, they send a full infantry charge, and when they arrive over the crest of the hill, the Dutch are at the bottom, they're hiding in the brush, and they end up firing on them with their Mauser rifles. So if you're the British, you're at the top, you're kind of screwed. The one you can't really run behind because you're in the middle of an open field. Their one kind of tactic they had to rely on was to just drop down where they were. And there they stayed in 12 hours of sun. Some of them got dehydrated and died. Again, remember, you're in Africa, right? And then eventually, once visibility didn't get so good, they ended up getting up and retreating, losing massive amounts of men, massive casualties in this battle. So the Dutch are seeing major success. Still, even with all of this, you're up against the British Empire, right? The British are going to end up winning and taking those gold and diamond reserves. Okay, so let's catch the last bit of that. All of South Africa ends up being taken and becoming a British colony, but to this day there remains large number of Dutch who live there. Oh, and by the way, it was a coordinated effort between the British citizens and the Dutch counterparts to end up implementing really harsh restrictions and laws against, that would be a lot like the South in America up until the 1980s, 1990s, okay? So you would end up having Jim Crow-like laws in South Africa for that amount of time, while the whites ended up exploiting the resources there. So that's the Boer War. That's how it ended up kind of working out. 3 years, didn't have to be that long, but this, guys, is the material that you're going to have to do for notes. We are done for the day.